Welcome to the deep dive. We're going straight into the latest PortalFuse weekly security report.
Yeah, let's do it.
Today, our focus is the June 10th, 2025 Patch Tuesday release. Pretty standard timing.
That's right. And the numbers. Well, we've got 38 new CVEs this month.
38. Okay. How does that stack up?
It's actually very close to the average we've been seeing, just 3 fewer than May. So pretty much business as usual in terms of volume.
Right. And the usual suspects in terms of vulnerability types, I assume.
Yep. The whole gang's here. We're looking at remote code execution, elevation of privilege, always a favorite, information disclosure, some denial of service, and security feature bypass vulnerabilities too.
Okay. So our job today, as always, is to really unpack this report. We want to pull out the critical details, figure out what really needs your immediate attention for all those Windows systems you're managing out there.
Exactly. Cut through the noise, find the actionable stuff. What's going to ruin your weekend if you don't patch it?
Precisely. Okay, let's start with remote code execution, RCE. Arguably the scariest category, right? Attacker runs their own code. Game over, potentially.
Often, yeah. It's the foothold, or sometimes the whole compromise in one go. And this month kicks off with a critical one, CVE 2025-209828.
Okay, critical RCE. What component?
Windows Schannel.
Channel. Okay, so that's the SSL TLS handler in Windows. This is going to impact, well, anything listening for secure connections. Web servers, mail servers.
Exactly. Anything that accepts TLS connections could be vulnerable. The vulnerability itself is actually in the Windows cryptographic services layer the channel uses.
And the technical detail. What's the flaw?
The report describes it as a missing memory release after its effective lifetime. So basically, dynamic memory gets allocated, used for something, and then it's not properly freed up when it's supposed to be.
A classic memory management bug, then? Use after free or something similar?
It sounds like it could lead to that kind of condition, yeah. Leaving memory in a potentially unstable or predictable state that an attacker might be able to leverage.
And how does an attacker trigger this? Over the network, I assume, given channel.
Yes, remotely exploitable over the network. And here's the really concerning part. It can be triggered by an unauthorized attacker.
Unauthorized?
Yep. No authentication needed, no prior privileges on the target system.
Wow.
And, crucially, no user interaction required either.
Okay, stop right there. Remote, unauthenticated, no user interaction. That's the trifecta for a wormable vulnerability, isn't it? Or at least something highly exploitable against exposed services.
It has all those characteristics, definitely. Now, there is one mitigating factor mentioned.
Okay, what's the catch?
The exploitation method requires sending specially crafted, fragmented client hello messages during the TLS handshake.
Fragmented client hello.
Yeah.
Okay, so the attacker needs to mess with the initial TLS negotiation packets at a pretty low level.
Exactly. They need to carefully construct and time these fragmented messages to trigger the memory issue. Because of that, Microsoft rates the attack complexity as high.
High complexity. Okay, that might slow down the script kiddies. But a determined attacker targeting, say, a specific organization's VPN gateway or public web server, they'll figure it out, won't they?
You have to assume they will, yes, especially given the potential payoff. The impact is listed as a total loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Full compromise.
So despite the high complexity, the critical rating feels absolutely justified. This needs to be top of the patching list for any system taking TLS connections. Firewalls, web servers, Exchange servers, ADFS, anything.
Absolutely. No question. This is priority 1 from the RCE list. The remediation, well, it's covered by the usual cumulative updates. The MSRC details link specific KBs. We're seeing KB 5060999 mentioned a lot.
Right.
KB 5060842, that seems to be for the newer OS versions like Windows 11 24H2 and Server 2025, and KB 5060841, which is often listed as a security hot patch linked to KB 5060842.
Okay, so check the docs for your specific OS, but the main CU should cover it.
Good.
What's next in RCE?
Next up is CVE 2025-33066. This one's rated high, with a CVSS score of 8.8. It affects the Windows Routing and Remote Access Service, RRAS.
RRAS, okay. So VPN servers, direct access potentially, maybe older dial-up stuff if anyone still uses that. What's the vulnerability type?
It's a heap-based buffer overflow within RRAS, also network exploitable, and also leading to arbitrary code execution.
Okay. High severity RCE and RAS. What are the attacker requirements for this one? Different from channel?
Yes, quite different. It can be exploited by an unauthorized attacker over the network.
Okay.
But it requires user interaction.
Okay. So the attacker needs to trick a legitimate user into doing something, like connecting to a malicious RRAS server.
Exactly that. Social engineering, phishing. Convince a user to initiate a connection to a specially crafted malicious server designed to trigger a buffer overflow in their client or system when it tries to connect.
Gotcha. So patching is crucial, but user training and maybe egress filtering could help mitigate here too. Less directly exploitable than the Schannel one, but still very serious if you use RRAS extensively.
Definitely. If that user interaction happens, the attacker gets code execution. It's a significant risk for any environment relying on RRAS. The KBs mentioned cover a wide range, including KB5060999, KB5060998, KB5060842, KB5060841.
Okay.
And interestingly, the source material specifically calls out KBs for older server OCs, like Server 2012 R2, 2012, even 2008 R2. So this vulnerability might have quite a long tail across different Windows versions, even some that might be nearing end of life or out of support.
Good point. Need to check those older systems if they're still running RRAS.
Mm.
Okay, what else in the high RCE category?
We have CVE 2025-33053, also high, also CVSS 8.8. This one impacts WebDAV, Web Distributed Authoring and Versioning.
It's another network-based RCE. The description points to external control of file names or paths. So it sounds like an issue with how WebDAV processes file operations, maybe allowing path traversal or something similar via maliciously crafted file names.
And attacker requirements, similar to the RRAS one. Very similar. Needs an unauthorized attacker, no prior privileges needed, but again requires user interaction. The attacker has to convince the user to click on or interact with a specially crafted URL.
Right, so clicking a link in an email maybe, that points to a malicious WebDAV share.
That kind of scenario, yeah. When the system tries to process that malicious URL via WebDAV, the vulnerability gets triggered, leading to code execution.
Okay, so important if you have WebDAV enabled, especially on servers, or if your users interact with external WebDAV locations, patching is key.
Exactly. The KBs listed are pretty broad again. KB5060999, KB5060998, KB5060842, KB5060841, and KB5060533. Seems like the standard cumulative updates are catching most of these.
Good. Now, the outline mentioned a second, RRAS RCE, also rated high, CVE 2025-33064. How's this one different from the first RRAS RCE, the one requiring user interaction?
Ah, yes, good catch. This is also a heap-based buffer overflow in RRAS, also network exploitable, but the difference is key. This one, CVE 2025-33064, requires an authenticated attacker.
Authenticate. Okay, so not just anyone on the internet,
Yeah.
but
But the required privilege level is low. Basic authenticated user. And critically, this one requires no user interaction.
So if an attacker manages to phish some low-level domain credentials or compromises a machine and gets a user token, they could potentially hit an RRAS server directly with this vuln.
Precisely. They just need network access to the RRAS server and valid low-privilege credentials. Then they can send a specially crafted protocol message directly to the server, trigger the overflow, and get code execution. No user needs to click anything.
That's a very different and arguably more dangerous scenario in many corporate environments where internal compromise is a major concern. What's the impact?
Impact is rated high across confidentiality, integrity, is availability. Potential for complete control of the RRAS server.
Okay, so two significant RRAS vulns this month, attacking from different angles. One needs user interaction but no auth. The other has auth but no user interaction. Both need patching urgently if you're running RRAS.
Absolutely. They cover different threat models. The KBs for this second, authenticated RRAS RCE, are KB5060999, KB5060842, and KB5060841. Again, covered by the main cumulative updates for supported systems.
Right. So Schannel is the big unauthenticated RCE worry, but these RAS ones are definitely not to be ignored.
Definitely not.
Oh.
Okay, shall we move on to elevation of privilege?
Yeah, let's do it. EOP. The attacker's already in, maybe as a standard user, and now they want power. System, admin, domain admin.
And we've got some really worrying ones here too. Two critical EOPs this month. First one, CVE 2025-33070. This is in Windows Netlogon.
Netlogon. Okay, red flag immediately. That's core domain authentication stuff.
Right.
Where does this impact primarily? Domain controller.
The main controllers are the prime target, yes. Absolutely. The vulnerability is in the Netlogon service itself. Technical cause listed as use of uninitialized resources.
And the attack vector, local.
Network-based exploitation.
Network-based EOP against Netlogon. Okay, attacker requirements.
This is the scary part. Unauthorized attacker.
Unauthorized for an elevation of privilege of vulnerability against Netlogon on a DC. How does that work? They elevate from nothing to domain admin.
That seems to be the implication. The description says an unauthorized attacker can send specially crafted authentication requests to a domain controller. The goal is potentially gaining domain administrator privileges.
Wow. Okay. That sounds almost too bad to be true. Is there a catch like the channel RCE? High complexity?
Yes, attack complexity is rated high. The notes say it requires the attacker to prepare the target environment in some way first. That suggests it might not be trivial to pull off, maybe needs specific timing or reconnaissance or some other prerequisite condition met on the DC or network.
Okay, high complexity is something, but still. The potential for an unauthorized network attacker to elevate to domain admin via Netlogon, that's nightmare fuel for anyone running Active Directory.
Completely agree. This is arguably the most critical vulnerability this month for enterprise environments, alongside the channel RCE, maybe even more so given the target.
Patching domain controllers for this is absolutely priority zero, non-negotiable. You cannot risk this.
Agreed. Patch all your DCs immediately. The KBs listed cover both client and server OSAs, since Netlogon runs on workstations too, but the real risk is on the DCs. KBs mentioned include KB5060999, KB5060998, KB5060842, KB5060841, and KB5060533. And the source emphasizes for older servers, make sure you apply the latest monthly rollup or security update containing the fix. Double-check the patch notes.
Oh, wow. Netlogon EOP. All right, what's the second critical EOP?
CVE 2025-33067. This one affects the Windows Task Scheduler, but the vulnerability is actually in the Windows kernel itself.
Task scheduler, leveraging a kernel flaw. Okay. Attack vector, local, I assume.
Yes, this is a local elevation of privilege. The root cause is improper privilege management in the kernel components used by Task Scheduler.
And attacker requirements. This is often the key differentiator for local EOPs.
This is why it's critical. Exploitable by an unauthorized attacker.
Unauthorized locally, so like guest access or just any standard user.
The implication is essentially anyone who can execute code locally, even with zero initial privileges.
Yeah.
And it requires no prior privileges to gain system.
No prior privileges needed to get system.
Correct. And also requires no user interaction.
Okay, wait. So if an attacker gets any kind of code execution on a box, maybe via a malicious email attachment opened by a user, or exploiting some other lower severity vuln, they can just run an exploit for this task scheduler kernel bug and boom, their system.
That's exactly the risk. It's a direct, low-friction path from basic code execution to full system control.
And complexity.
Low. The notes specifically say attackers can expect repeatable success.
Okay, this is a really nasty local EOP. Critical impact system, no privileges needed, no user interaction, low complexity. This affects pretty much every vulnerable Windows machine out there, client and server.
Absolutely. It's a prime candidate for attackers to use in the post-exploitation phase once they get that initial foothold. Patching this broadly and quickly is extremely important.
Agreed. Very high priority. KBs.
Included in the standard cumulative updates again. KBs like KB5060999, KB5060998, KB5060842, KB5060841, KB5060533 are listed. The source also calls out specific KDs for certain OS versions like KB5060 and 010 for Server 2016, KB5060842 for Server 2045, Win1124H2, and KB5060511 for Server 2022. So, as always, check the MSRC details for your specific environment.
Right. So two absolutely critical EOPs, Netlogon for DCs, Task Scheduler for basically everything else.
Yes, a whole cluster of them. Let's run through some key ones. First, CVE 2025-32718. This affects the Windows SMB client.
SMB client EOP, local exploit.
Yes, local EOP. It's an integer overflow or wraparound vulnerability. It requires an authorized attacker, but only basic user privileges. And importantly, no user interaction needed.
So standard user compromises their own machine, or an attacker gets standard user creds. They can run this exploit locally and potentially get system.
That's the risk, yes. Once they have that local, low-privilege access, they can trigger this flaw programmatically. KBs covering this include KB5060999, KB5060842, and KB5060841. The notes also mention using USA.exe for some specific updates containing this fix, which might be relevant for deployment scripting.
Okay. Next, high EOP.
Yeah.
CVE 2025-32714 in Windows Installer.
Another local EOP, CVSS 7.8. This one is due to improper access control within the Windows Installer Service, MSISAC. Again, requires an authorized attacker with low privileges, no user interaction.
But, is there a but?
The report notes that exploitation typically requires physical or console access to the system.
Ah, okay. That lowers the risk somewhat compared to purely remote or programmatic local exploits. Still important for kiosks, shared workstations, maybe lab environments, or insider threats, though.
Exactly, and it's classified under CW 284, improper access control, which just reinforces the need for tight controls around system utilities like the installer. KBs are the standard ones again. KB 5060999, KB 5060842, KB 5060841.
Got it. Next, CVE 2025-3271112 affecting Win32K.
Yet the kernel mode graphics and windowing subsystem. High severity local EOP, CVSS 7.8. This is a use after free vulnerability, specifically in the graphics part, GRFX.
Use after free in Win32K. Classic EOP vector requirement.
Same pattern as the SMB client one. Authorized attacker, low privileges, no user interaction needed to potentially gain system.
So another tool in the attacker's local escalation toolkit if they get that initial foothold.
Pretty much. Patching plugs another hole. KBs listed include KB 5060999, KB 5060842, KB 5060841, with specific mentions like KB 5061010, KB 5060533 for certain OCs.
Okay. There was also one mentioned for the Windows Remote Access Connection Manager, CVE 2025-47955.
Yes, another high-severity CVSS 7.8 local EOP. Improper privilege management in the Connection Manager service allows an authorized low-privilege attacker to potentially gain system access locally with no user interaction.
But didn't the notes say something about the patch timing for this one?
Good memory. Yes, the source material indicates patches for the specific CVE were actually released back in May 2025.
Okay, so if you're up to date with your May patches, you should already be covered for this particular Remote Access Connection Manager EOP.
Correct. The KBs associated confirm that. KB 505-8497, KB 505-8411, KB 505-8415, KB 505-8387, KB 505-8379, all from May. A good reminder to stay current month to month.
Definitely. Okay, let's quickly hit the remaining high-severity EOPs listed. Quite a few more. CVE 2025-33075, Windows Installer again.
Yes, another one in Windows Installer. This is described as an improper link resolution, or link following vulnerability. Think symbolic links or junctions pointing somewhere unexpected. Allows an authorized low-privilege attacker to exploit locally, no user interaction, potentially gaining system. KB C060999, KB 5060998, KB 5060842, KB 5060533, CVE 2025-33073, back to SMB client.
Right. Improper access control issue here. Rated high, 7.8. This one's interesting because it's a network-based EOP. Requires an authorized attacker, low privileges. User interaction is mentioned as required only if the victim connects to a malicious SMB server set up by the attacker. Potential for system privileges.
Network EOP via SMB, that's concerning.
It is, and the source specifically calls out mitigations beyond patching for this one, like enabling SMB signing and restricting share access. Defense in depth for SMB. KBs, KB 5060999, KB 5060998, KB 5060842, KB 5060841, KB 5060533.
Okay, CVE 2025-32716, Windows Media Component.
And out-of-bounds read vulnerability. Local EOP 7.8, authorized attacker, low privileges, no user interaction, potential system access. Classic memory corruption path. KB 2287999, KB 5060842, common log file system driver, CLFS.
Ah, CLFS. We see EOPs here fairly often. This one's a heap-based buffer overflow. Local EOP 7.8, authorized low privileges, no user interaction, potential system. Again, familiar pattern. KB 5060999, KB 5060842, KB 5060841.
And the last one in this high EOP rundown, CBE 255-32721, Windows recovery driver. Right. This is another improper link resolution or link following issue, like the Windows Installer one, local EOP authorized attacker. This one does require user interaction, though the user needs to open a malicious link, but the attack complexity is low if they do. Potential gain is administrator privileges, not necessarily system. KBs, KB 5060999, KB 5060842, KB 5060841, with specific builds mentioned.
Okay, whew. That's a lot of ways for an attacker with low privileges to try and become admin or system. It really hammers home why patching these local EOPs is so critical, assuming breach or initial access is always a possibility.
Absolutely. You have to close these internal escalation paths. Patching raises the difficulty significantly for attackers moving laterally or vertically within your network.
Agreed. All right, let's shift gears to information disclosure vulnerabilities. ID, not always code execution, but leaking data attackers can use.
And the big story this month for ID, looking at the CVE list, is definitely the Windows storage management provider. There's a whole slew of vulnerabilities reported there.
Yeah, it really stands out. Let's start with the high-severity ones first. CVE 2025-33060, and that's storage management provider.
Right. High severity ID. It's an out-of-bounds read. Exploitable locally by an authorized attacker with basic user privileges, no user interaction needed. The report notes a total loss of confidentiality for the disclosed info.
Total loss. So it's leaking something pretty sensitive then, not just a minor memory address.
But that's the implication, yes. Could be cryptographic material, sensitive configuration data, who knows. Needs patching. KBEs, KB5060999, KB5060842, KB5060841, with specific OS builds noted.
Okay. Next, high ID. CVE 2025-32722, this time in the Windows storage port driver.
Slightly different component, but related. Also high severity ID. This one's due to improper access control. Requires an authorized attacker, low privileges, local access, no user interaction. The really significant impact noted here is leaking kernel memory addresses.
Kernel addresses. Okay, that's valuable for bypassing ASLR, address space layout randomization. Makes other exploits, like memory corruption ones, much easier to write and execute reliably.
Exactly. Leaking kernel pointers is a classic technique for exploit development. This is also rated as total loss of confidentiality, likely because of its utility in enabling other attacks. KBEs, KB5060999, KB5060842, KB5060841, again with specific build info.
Got it. Then there's CVE 2025-32715, affecting the Remote Desktop Protocol Client, RDP Client ID.
Yes, this one's different. High severity ID, but it's an out-of-bounds read in the client software. Importantly, it's exploitable over the network by an unauthorized attacker.
Unauthorized network, but
it needs user interaction. The attacker has to trick the user into connecting their RDP client to a malicious RDP server.
Similar pattern to the RRAS and WebDAV RCEs requiring user interaction. What gets leaked?
The description says the attacker can read small portions of heap memory from the client system, maybe not huge amounts, but potentially enough to find useful pointers or data snippets for other purposes. Impact is high confidentiality.
And patching this one involves updating the RDP client itself.
Correct. KBS, KB5060999, KB5060842, KB5060841 cover the OS level components, but the source specifically calls out updating the remote desktop client application to version 1.2.6278.0 or later. That's a key detail for client-side patching.
Good catch. Can't just patch the servers. Okay, back to the storage management provider. Two more high-severity IDs listed there, CVE 2025-33055 and CVE 2025-24065.
Yeah, both out-of-bounds reads in the storage management provider. Both require an authorized attacker, low privileges, local access, no user interaction. Both leak sensitive info locally described as small portions of heap memory, or for DAG as 24065, exposing the caller's address space memory.
What's interesting is that CVE 2025-24065 is listed with a CVSS of 5.5, usually important, but the impact is high confidentiality. Any idea why?
Sometimes the CVSS base score calculation doesn't perfectly align with the perceived real-world impact, especially for info disclosure where the value of the leaked info is contextual. Microsoft might rate the confidentiality impact higher based on what can be leaked, even if the exploitability metrics result in a lower CVSS score. Regardless, patching is needed. KBs for NAC-3055 include the broad set 5060999, 5060998, 5060841, 5060533. KBs for NAC 24065 aren't singled out, but would be in the same batch of updates fixing storage management provider issues.
Okay, that covers the high-severity IDs. Now, that big cluster of important severity ones, almost all in the storage management provider. Looks like 10 of them.
It's quite remarkable. We have CVE 2025-33065, 33062, 33069-24068, 33058, 33061, and -33061. All rated important, mostly CVSS 5.5, and overwhelmingly targeting the Windows storage management provider.
What's the common thread here? Are they all basically the same kind of bug?
Pretty much. The dominant theme is out-of-bounds reads. The attack vector is consistently local. Requirements are typically an authorized attacker with low privileges, and usually no user interaction needed. The impact is consistently described as disclosing sensitive information locally, often small portions of heap memory.
Any variations within that group?
A couple, like NAC 33063 and NAC 3061, are noted as requiring physical or logical console access, similar to that Windows installer EOP, and NAC 24068 is specifically called a buffer overread, but that's still a type of out-of-bounds read. Fundamentally, they're all local memory leakage vulnerabilities in the same component area.
So, while maybe none are critical on their own, the sheer number suggests this storage management provider component might have had some systemic issues or was a focus for vulnerability research. Patching it comprehensively seems wise.
I'd agree. It paints a picture. Even minor info leaks can sometimes be chained together or used to enable other exploits. It's best to plug all these holes. Remediation is via the standard cumulative updates, with KBs like 5060999, 5060842, 5060118, 5060810, 5060531, 5060526 appearing in the lists, depending on the specific CVE and OS version. Check MSRC for the specifics for your systems.
Okay. Any other notable ID vulns outside that storage cluster?
Just a couple more. CVE 2025-33052 is an important severity. CVSS 5.5, ID in the DWM core library desktop window manager.
DWM, okay, what's the issue there?
Use of an uninitialized resource allows an authorized low-privilege attacker local access, no user interaction, to disclose uninitialized stack memory. Maybe less likely to contain super-sensitive info than heap or kernel memory, but still not ideal.
Right.
KB 4060999, KB 4600842, KB 5060841.
Then one moderate severity one.
Right. CVE 2025-47969. CVSS 4.4. This is a Windows virtualization-based security. BBS impacting Windows low components. Exposure of sensitive information. The interesting thing here is it requires an attacker who already has high privileges locally.
High privileges needed to exploit. That seems less worrying.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
But it's still a flaw. And like a couple others we mentioned, patches for this were released in May 2025. KBOS, KB 5058497, KB 5058411, KB 5058405 cover it. So again, staying current helps.
Good point. Okay, so the ID landscape is dominated by storage management provider this month, but with important side notes for RDP client, DWM, and VB Shello.
That sums it up well. Now, shall we talk denial of service?
Let's do it. DOS, taking systems offline. What are the highlights?
The focus this month seems to be on LSA and LSASS, the core security authority components. Very critical services.
Definitely. First one listed is CVE 2025-33057 and Windows LSA, Local Security Authority.
Correct. High severity DOS rated as causing a total loss of availability. It's a null pointer dereference vulnerability. Exploitation is network-based.
Network DOS against LSA requirement.
It requires an authorized attacker, low privileges needed, no user interaction required.
Okay, so similar to that authenticated RRAS RCE, if an attacker gets low-level creds, they can potentially launch a DOS attack over the network against LSA on vulnerable systems.
That's the scenario. Limits the attack surface compared to unauthenticated, but still a risk from any compromised account or insider threat. KBs covering it include KB 5060999, KB 5060998, KB 5060842, KB 5060841, KB 5060533.
Got it. Next DOS. CVE 2025-33056, affecting Microsoft Local Security Authority Server, LSASS RV.
Right, the server process for LSA.
Well,
Also, high-severity DOS, leading to complete loss of availability. This one's due to an improper access control issue.
and the requirements here. This is the key difference often.
Exactly. This one is exploitable over the network by an unauthorized attacker. No prior privileges, no user interaction needed.
Ooh, okay. Unauthenticated network DOS against LSASS RV, that's much more concerning. Taking out LSASS RV remotely without needing creds, that could disrupt authentication and security policy enforcement significantly, especially on servers or DCs.
It's a major availability risk for critical systems relying on LSASS RV. Needs prompt patching. KBs are the same broad set. KB 5060999, KB 5060998, KB 5060842, KB 5060533.
Okay, and there was a third DOS mention, CVE 2025-32724, affecting LSASS itself, the subsystem service.
Yes, also high-severity DOS, rated to fully deny access and cause significant availability problems. This one falls under CWE 400, uncontrolled resource consumption.
Resource exhaustion DOS against LSASS,
Yep.
network-based.
Yes, network-based. And unlike the LSASS RV one, it requires an unauthorized attacker, no prior privileges, and no user interaction.
So two distinct unauthenticated network DOS vulnerabilities targeting core security services, LSASS, RV, and LSASS this month. That's bad. LSASS handles so much critical stuff, authentication tokens, password changes, security policy lookups. Taking that down remotely is a huge problem.
It really is. These two are probably the most significant availability threats this month. Patching is critical across the board, not just servers, as LSASS runs everywhere. KBs for this LSASS resource exhaustion DOS are KB 5060999, KB 5060999, KB 5060842, and KB 5060841. The course also mentions specific patching methods for some OCs, like using PowerShell's install Windows Update -KB 5061010, or grabbing updates from the catalog, perhaps for older systems or specific scenarios.
Okay, so prioritize patching those unauthenticated LSASS DOS vulns. Got it. That brings us to the last category. Security feature bypass, SFB circumventing defenses.
Right. And there's a particularly interesting critical one here, though it's a bit different. CVE 2025-3052. It's reported via CertCC and relates to Insyde H2O Secure Boot.
Secure boot bypass. In firmware, how does that relate to Patch Tuesday?
It's relevant because the vulnerability involves a UEFI application that was signed using a Microsoft third-party UEFI certificate. So Microsoft signing infrastructure is involved, even though the bug is in the firmware code from Insyde. That's why it gets tracked alongside Windows security issues.
Okay, makes sense. What's the actual vulnerability?
It's an untrusted pointer dereference in that signed UEFI application. It's a local attack vector.
Local requirement.
Authorized attacker, but requires high privileges locally to exploit, like administrator or system.
So an attacker who already owns the box at a high level can use this firmware bug to bypass secure boot. What's the impact of bypassing secure boot?
It fundamentally undermines the system's boot integrity. An attacker could load an unsigned bootloader, kernel, or rootkit very early in the boot process, before the OS loads its defenses. This allows for extremely stealthy and persistent malware. The impact is rated as complete loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability because that root of trust is broken.
Okay, critical impact, but needs high local privileges first. And the fix isn't a Windows KB, right? It's a firmware update.
Exactly. Remediation requires a BIOS UEFI update from your system manufacturer, Dell, HP, Lenovo, etc., that includes the patched Insyde H2O code. You need to check your hardware vendor's support site, not Windows Update. Very important distinction. Need to coordinate with hardware management for that one. Okay, what about OS-level SFBs? CDE 2025-33069, affecting Windows App Control for Business, WDAC.
Yes. This is rated moderate to high severity. It's an improper verification of cryptographic signatures within WDAC's policy enforcement.
So it lets an attacker potentially bypass WDAC application whitelisting. How's it exploited?
It's a local vulnerability. An unauthorized attacker can exploit it with no user interaction and no prior privileges needed.
No privileges needed to bypass WDAC. That sounds pretty bad for orgs relying on WDAC.
It is. If an attacker gets basic code execution, they could potentially leverage this flaw to make their malicious code appear properly signed, fooling WDAC and allowing execution even when policy should block it. It essentially weakens or bypasses that core WDAC protection locally. KBs addressing this include KB 5060842 and KB 5060841, and the notes mention it affects newer OCs like Server 2025 and Windows 11 24H2, where WDAC adoption is higher.
Okay, definitely relevant for WDAC users.
Yeah.
Lastly, CVE 2025-47160 related to Windows shortcut files, .lng files. Right. Moderate severity, SFB, CVSS 5.4. Classified as a protection mechanism failure, CWE 693, in the Windows shell's handling of shortcuts. It's exploitable over a network.
Network.requirements.
Needs user interaction. Attacker has to convince the user to open a specially crafted file, like a malicious.lng file.
Ah, the classic malicious shortcut vector. What security feature does it bypass?
It can potentially evade defenses, like the mark of the web, MOTW. MOTW is what flags files downloaded from the internet, triggering warnings or stricter checks by things like SmartScreen. If MOTW is bypassed, a malicious file might run with fewer warnings or security checks.
Gotcha. It lowers the barrier for other attacks by weakening a protective mechanism. Impact is limited loss of integrity availability of those features. KBs covering this are KB 5060999, KB 5060998, KB 5060842, KB 5060841, and KB 5060533.
And it underscores the need for user awareness training about suspicious files and links, even with patching, defense in depth.
Always. Patches are essential but not sufficient on their own. Okay, that covers all the categories. Quite a mix this month. Let's try to wrap this up and summarize the key takeaways for administrators listening.
Sounds good. It was a fairly average month by volume, but with some definitely critical items needing urgent focus.
Absolutely. Based on our discussion and the report details, the absolute top priorities seem to be: first, that critical channel RCE CVE 2025-29828. Patch any system accepting TLS connections immediately: web servers, VPNs, mail servers, DCs, everything.
Agreed. Second, the critical Netlogon EOP, CVE 2025-3307. Patch all domain controllers without delay. The potential impact is just too high.
Third, the critical task scheduler kernel EOP CVE 2025-33067 needs broad deployment across all clients and servers, as it's a very easy path to system from low privilege.
Definitely. After those criticals, I'd highlight the two unauthenticated network DOS vulnerabilities affecting LSASS RV, CVE 2025-33056, and LSASS, CVE 2025-32724. Significant availability risk there.
Good point. And while not critical, that large volume of information disclosure vulnerabilities in the Windows storage management provider warrants attention through comprehensive patching too.
Yeah, patch hygiene there seems important.
Yeah.
And don't forget the RRAS, RCEs, authenticated and unauthenticated if you use that service, and the various high-severity local EOPs in SMB client, Win32K, etc.
Right. So looking at the KBs that seem to cover many of these important vulnerabilities, system admins should probably focus their testing and deployment efforts around these key updates, checking specifics for their OS versions, of course. KB 5060999 seems to cover a lot on Windows 11 and maybe other versions.
Yes.
KB 5060842 looks crucial for the latest platforms, Windows 11 24, H2, and Server 2025.
Right, often paired with KB 5060841, the hot patch.
KB 5060533 for Windows 10 versions like 22H2, 21H2, KB 5060118 and KB 5060526 for Server 2022 and Server 2025 core.
Yep.
And KB 50610 MEN-AIR for older supported platforms like Server 2016 and Windows 10 1607.
That covers the main ones frequently mentioned. And just a reminder to check for specific KBs if you're running older supported server OCs like 2012 or 2012 R2, especially for things like the RRAS fixes, KB 5061018, KB 5061059, etc., and update that RDP client for CVE 2025-32715.
Good reminders. Prioritize based on the services running in your environment, DCs, TLS servers, RRAS, WebDAV, clients, but aim for comprehensive coverage with these cumulative updates after testing.
That's the plan. Patching is crucial for maintaining your security posture.
Absolutely. So as we close out this deep dive, here's something to think about as you're planning your patching and broader security strategy. We saw critical network vulnerabilities needing no authentication and critical local vulnerabilities needing no prior privileges. Beyond applying the patches themselves, what do you think is the single most impactful security practice or control that helps mitigate the risk from these kinds of fundamental vulnerabilities appearing month after month?
That's a good question. Definitely something to consider beyond just the patching cycle itself.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the June 2025 Patch Tuesday report.
Always a pleasure. Stay safe out there.
We'll catch you on the next one.